Hello, welcome to the University of Brighton podcast. I'm Richard Newman. This week we're talking about sport and sports journalism with Principal Lecturer Simon McEnnis about how sports has returned during COVID-19, the challenges of sports journalism during that time, and how the industry is being disrupted and shaken up by principally digital outlets. To demonstrate how fortunate we are to have Simon teaching future journalists, as well as his work at the uni, Simon's the Sports Journalist Chair of the National Council for the Training of Journalists, or NCTJ. Passing courses from the council is usually the industry requirement for employment. He was also a former sports journalist at The Sun and currently trains journalists at Sky Sports News. Simon, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on. I think first of all, it'd be good to get a little bit more detailed about your background. So you were a full-time journalist. What sort of things did you work on and why did the industry interest you?
Good question, actually. I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a journalist. I was involved in school magazines, ended up getting involved with the school newspaper, the university newspaper. I knew from an early age I was going to go on that trajectory. And after I went to university, I did a fast track NCTJ course. Then I started work with local papers in Essex. I started off as a news reporter. I then got my senior qualifications. And then I moved into sport and I became deputy sports editor of the Colchester Gazette. And then I moved on to Fleet Street and I went down a sort of tabloid route. And that was mainly because the local paper I was working at was very kind of sort of quite tabloidy in terms of its kind of positioning. And it made sense, therefore, if I was going to go into Fleet Street, was to go kind of through that route. So I sort of started off just doing some sort of shift work at the now defunct News of the World, and ended up getting a job on the sports desk of The Sun. And I was there for about sort of 8-9 years. And then I decided to move into academia with the university at the beginning of 2009. So yeah, I've been at Brighton now for a while, for a good sort of 11 years now.
Mm. What was the reason to move into academia for you? And tell us about the work as well you do with Sky and the NCTJ.
Yeah, well, it wasn't an easy decision, that was for sure. I mean, it's not, it's quite unusual, if you've got a job with a sports desk on a sort of national newspaper of a national news organisation. It's kind of quite difficult to sort of give that up. But I personally felt that, I sort of wanted a change, really. I think the nature of sports journalism is you're doing a lot of sort of evenings, weekends, and that was great. I had a great time there. When I was sort of in my 20s, sort of early 30s, but then I started to want to sort of move into, my priorities, I think, in life changed. And I was interested in the idea, I suppose, of thinking and writing about sports journalism. I knew the industry was changing. I mean, we have to remember that the time I was in the industry was a time of absolutely massive change. I saw that transition really sort of from print to web. And even when I left the industry, that transition was still going on. I left in 2009 and, Twitter, which has been a massively transformative platform in sports journalism, wasn't really sort of kind of widely adopted for usage till about 2010. So I didn't have that kind of experience. So yeah, I saw that kind of move towards web and worked in that. And that was a really interesting time, really, to be working in the industry. But, for me, I felt it was the right time to move. I like the idea of working in university and working with students and, thinking about ways of kind of, I suppose, improving the industry, improving the profession. That's kind of what I wanted to work with students on. When I left in 2009, it was kind of around the time where there was some ethical problems, let's say, in the industry. I was working at News International, which is now News UK, obviously at a time where, unbeknownst to us on the sports desk, there was sort of phone hacking sort of going on in the news department. And I was there at the newspaper when that was all happening. So I think to get to that kind of point and think, well, actually, I'm seeing the sort of issues that are kind of happening here. It was a good opportunity to sort of move in and start thinking about the sort of industry more. And at that time, sports journalism was a very sort of kind of was very much its formative early stages, really, in terms of a kind of research field, if you like. And it's been really interesting over the last 11 years to sort of see how that's kind of really grown and matured. And it's been, I think it's been really exciting to be a part of that.
So what about the work you do elsewhere as well, the positions you have at like training journalists at Sky and places like that?
Yeah, so basically it was an interesting one because when I started at the university, I was still doing Saturdays at the News of the World. And, when I joined the university, it was really important to me that I kind of kept that involvement with industry. And obviously a decision was taken amidst the phone hacking scandal to close the News of the World. And I was thinking, oh, crikey, okay, well, how am I going to keep my industry links now? And it was literally a week after the News of the World closed. I got a phone call from the NCCJ to say that Sky Sports News are looking to sort of launch this kind of sort of staff development sort of process. And they're looking for somebody from kind of like a print background, somebody with watching experience, and they kind of thought that I might be able to do that. So that's how I got involved in, and that was back in sort of 2011. So I've been involved with Sky now for a while, and that's really, it's great. I mean, it's really interesting. I don't come from a broadcast background, so it's been really interesting to sort of go in there and see, I think, some of the differences, if you like, between broadcast and print, and the new ways of working, also the challenges that they've been facing, particularly over the last sort of 10 years. And it's been great to sort of work with the journalists there. And really, it's not a setup where I kind of tell them what to do. I just try and create an environment where they're kind of reflecting, on their practice, and trying to encourage them to really think, quite deeply about what they're doing. And, you're talking about journalists who work in an unbelievably busy, fast, 24-hour rolling news environment. And, it's a great opportunity, I think, for them to just kind of take a little bit of time out, come into a room with me and just think about what they're doing away from the newsroom. And I'd like to think that they really appreciate that and they really get a lot out of it, to be honest. And I think it feeds back into the newsroom. I think it makes them better journalists, more reflective practitioners. And I think that can only be a good thing for both the organisation and for, sports journalism, in general, really, because certainly in this country, Sky Sports News are probably, one of the most visible outlets, if you like, of sports journalism, really. So, it's great to be involved in that. And it's something that I really, really enjoy. In terms of the NCTJ involvement, just to clarify, I'm the chair of the sports journalism board, not the overall, not the overall organisations. Just to clarify that, and that involves kind of setting national exams. It also involves kind of chairing a board of, I suppose, sort of markers, if you like, where we kind of determine the kind of subject benchmarks for sports journalism training in the UK. And obviously, that's something that we're constantly having to review as the industry changes, and we get a lot of feedback from the industry on, how it's all evolving and what have you. So that's a good thing to be involved with as well. And it's great to be in a position where I sort of feel I can kind of help, make a major contribution in terms of sort of shaping that kind of sort of those benchmark standards, really, in this country.
Just coming to your work at the university and the journalism and sports journalism courses, we know it's a strange time for everyone at the moment. How will the courses adapt this autumn? But also placement-wise, students may be, a little bit concerned they won't be able to go on placement. Can you tell us how that will be tackled?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because, in a way, it's something that we've already had to confront because when lockdown started, our third years were in the process of submitting their work placement portfolios for assessment, really. So we had to start thinking about, kind of more liberal interpretations of what constitutes work experience and work placement. Obviously, once the lockdown started, newsrooms were, kind of reorganizing themselves so that only essential workers were sort of going in there. So obviously in that situation, the kind of work placement schemes they were running were sort of the first to go in many respects. So that was out of the question. And it was just about being more flexible in your thinking. I mean, as the industry was kind of moving into ways of working, then I think the kind of student activity kind of started to go with that. And I think that will continue to evolve into the next academic year. I mean, we've already been in a situation in the last few weeks where we've been contacted by companies saying they're looking for students to kind of get involved with working for their website and what have you, sort of on a remote basis. So I think as the industry is kind of moving into that kind of area, I think the kind of student contribution will sort of kind of come with it. So it's down to us really to be sort of quite flexible and quite accommodating in our sort of interpretation of what constitutes work experience for students. I mean, we've got our own content platform, overtimeonline.co.uk, which is the course website. And again, students, I think if they're contributing to that in itself is a kind of form of publishing, kind of, it's in the public domain. So we just have to make sure that, from a student point of view, we're not kind of creating kind of really narrow frameworks and interpretations around that. We've got to make that as easy as possible and as realistic as possible, I think, for students to achieve.
Mm. Before we move on from this, can you tell us about you leading the creation of new master's courses? Can you tell us a bit about that and the work which has gone into it?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a sport journalism course at the university since about 2003. It's a long-standing, well-established course, and around about 2014, I think it was, we started the journalism undergraduate course. So once that kind of happened, we were starting to think, well, actually, we're starting to kind of develop a bit of a cluster of journalism courses here, which is good. We kind of like to think we've been quite successful, really, in terms of recruitment over the years. And we thought it was an opportunity to kind of move the kind of subject area forward, take it to the next level with a master's program, hopefully kind of stimulate a little bit more of a kind of sort of research culture and an intellectual environment around the subject area. I mean, the masters are very much kind of aimed at students who maybe for their undergraduate studies have done a non-journalism related course, whether that's at Brighton or another institution. And it's an opportunity for them to kind of come with us and do a bit more focused study on journalism if they've established that's what they want to do. And they then get the professional qualifications, effectively do a kind of conversion year, and then they'll be in a better position to sort of go into the industry. So that was really the sort of two main sort of reasons behind it, which was to kind of expand the subject area, to sort of take it to a sort of the next level, and also to kind of make it possible for students who wouldn't otherwise get this opportunity to study with us to get that opportunity, really.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID and the impact it's had on sports journalism and sports. I guess as well, I should just say as well, I've been directly impacted by that. I'm a freelance sports journalist who saw my work disappear overnight. Something like that, pretty unprecedented. And it's forced almost every sports focused outlet to be creative and really think about what they're doing, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, I mean, it's quite funny actually, because already when we think about disruption it's caused sports journalism, we're already talking in the past tense, because of course Premier League is back up and running, cricket's back up and running, with start the second test already today. So sport has kind of I mean, it was a fairly brief period in many respects where it was in this situation, and it's kind of, I think, gradually kind of going back to normal in terms of how they're kind of covering live sport. Obviously, like you say, I think freelancers have been the big losers in that respect. And I think the way sports journalism really kind of, the general approach to the sort of pandemic to kind of coverage was really to kind of sort of delve into more sort of nostalgic elements of sport, really. It was kind of like almost summer's come early, because in sports journalism, the months of June and July tend to be relatively quiet, and that's when the whole gossip, transfer rumours kind of start to happen. And I think that just happened a bit earlier
Yeah.
this year as a result of that. But yeah, I mean, unprecedented situation. I mean, I can't really remember a time where there's been absolutely no sport to cover like that. Usually there's something going on. And I think the industry found itself in a very unprecedented situation. But yeah, like you say, undoubtedly freelancers were the big losers in that, because highly expendable, not really much protections. And yeah, that's just the way the industry works, unfortunately.
You say going back to normal. I mean, it certainly feels different from the other end, covering it from these new restrictions that we have, and also in terms of the access we're getting to people in sport, which is something we'll come to later when we're talking about how sports journalism is sort of evolving, really. And you wonder whether some of these things will be here to stay, in terms of not being able to get as good access to sports managers, to players. With the return of sport itself, how have you sort of found it? We're talking around the end of the Premier League season. So, I mean, do you think generally it's been a success?
I think it's been a success for the Premier League, probably. I mean, I think they've managed to get it up and running, and they don't seem to have had any sort of real issues or problems so far, particularly in terms of COVID-19, in terms of positive tests, that have kind of put a spanner in the works in terms of disrupting the original plans. I mean, it's a difficult one, really, in the sense that, I think as a starting point, we obviously have to understand that this was really all about the sort of broadcast deals and the TV rights, and fulfilling those contracts, because I think it would have cost the Premier League something like 260 million, something like that, on in kind of lost broadcast cash if they hadn't have completed the season. So there was obviously a massive financial incentive, let's say, to get things back and up and running, and that was obviously the kind of main driver behind this, really. How that sits, I'm not entirely sure.
But do you think it would have come back at all if these TV deals weren't in place? Would it be in a case of like a month or two ago, you would have said, you know what, we can't guarantee safety, let's give it a rest? If these massive deals weren't in place, not just TV deals, but commercial deals as well. So if you could take it just from a pure safety point of view and common sense, would we be watching sport now?
It's a really good question. I mean, obviously there's a lot of protocols that are in place. They've got the different zones at Premier League stadiums and what have you. They've got the frequent testing of players. I mean, I think they've got it to a point where I think that they've got some serious health and safety measures. So yeah, they got to a point where they kind of move forward with it, I guess. So yeah, I mean, it's happening. I mean, look, yes, what we've got to remember about this is, because there's so much money at stake, there's then a lot of money you can put into those health and safety measures. You can actually build the kind of infrastructure around that. I think it's going to be an interesting question, because obviously the only football that's really taking place at the moment is Premier League and Championship in this country. Once we get to the next season, where does that leave League One, League Two, clubs in the non-league pyramid, who maybe don't have those kind of access to the resources that it takes to make those kind of measures and those protocols work? So yeah, I think there's some interesting sort of longer term questions for football in general once we step outside the sort of top two tiers, really.
Where does it leave fans? Because they're often, especially in the Premier League, in the really cash rich sports, often kind of marginalized anyway. Now we're seeing no fans in stadiums, but record TV audiences. So we're able to see, aren't we, that the sport can short term still be a very attractive offer. There's the rhetoric of sport is nothing without fans, but at the moment it's surviving quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've known for a while. I mean, certainly probably in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been that kind of creeping sort of developments in the way that professional sport has become increasingly globalised, and that's been driven by broadcast deals, global broadcasting. And as that's kind of developed, the kind of, and grown in power, if you like, then what we've really effectively seen is the power that fans have kind of go the other way and decrease as that's increased, really. So we've kind of known that for a while. We know the sense of kind of alienation that a lot of fans feel because of these kind of globalized developments in professional sport. And I guess what's ended up happening now in Project Restart is just that stark manifestation of that realization of it, that here it is, the show is actually still going on, and they don't actually need fans, in order to make that happen, really. And once you get to that stark realization, then all it can probably lead to is even a further erosion of any kind of sort of any fan voice that's kind of left, really. I mean, it's fans are probably the big losers in this situation. Obviously, there's been the odd concession. There's a few games on terrestrial TV as a concession to that. You've got the sort of video fan wall, but that, they're fairly sort of kind of token sort of gestures, really. I mean, at the end of the day, the football is really going on without fans, we've got access to fan noise. Apparently 2/3 of viewers are kind of going for the fan noise option. So it's really all about the sort of broadcast experience. But we've known for a while that, the fans who have the power, particularly in football, are the ones who sit in armchairs, not necessarily, the ones who actually sit in the stadium. So, when we actually look back at the history of football, everything around the sports stadium was sort of kind of geared up towards the fans, all the advertising and what have you, any kind of razzmatazz, but that's long since gone. Anything that happens, in a stadium, even the fans themselves are all part of that, sort of global spectacle of sport, really. And I just think all that's happened now since Project Restart is just that stark that manifestation of all these kind of dynamics, really.
I guess there's a debate about whether the actual product on the pitch is quite as good. I've been inside the stadium as well, been lucky enough to be inside reporting on these Brighton Hove Albion games. I can tell you the atmosphere is very strange. I think only now we're starting to see players get used to maybe what they're playing under, and some of the quality of matches has got a bit better. But there is already talk of fans maybe coming in for next season. I know we're focusing on football a little bit here, but back into football grounds in September, that would be, maybe, I don't know, third, fall, maybe. We'll have to wait and see. And we're actually seeing maybe a return of spectators in our local area very soon, because when we're recording this, there's lots of talk about Glorious Goodwoods admitting somewhere close to, 5,000 spectators a day, which would be one of the first sports in the country to allow fans back in, which is ironic, I guess, because at the start of the pandemic, we had the Cheltenham Festival, which was taking place in packed crowds, and often criticised for that. It's a weird balance, isn't it, to get these fans back inside these sporting venues?
Yes, and obviously, presumably there's going to have to be some kind of social distancing measures, and that, is going to lead to kind of, drastically reduced capacities, you'd think, in sort of all the grounds and stadiums, really. I mean, yeah, it's interesting to say, to focus on football, because, I would say, watching the cricket, that feels even weirder, because I think, at least with football, we have some kind of familiarity. We've seen games played behind closed doors because of UEFA bans or whatever. It's not massively unfamiliar, but yeah, watching a test match where there's absolutely no fans, and it ends up feeling like a kind of, mid-table county cricket match, in sort of early September, is very much a weird experience. It's also worth pointing out, as we kind of focus on the Premier League, because obviously that's the big talking point, this kind of massive inequality, really, in sport, particularly in terms of men's sport being prioritised and women's sport really getting the thin end of the wedge. And again, when I said earlier about the stark manifestation of, sort of fan and broadcast power, we're seeing that as well in terms of those kind of gender inequalities in sport, and it's pretty clear where the sort of priorities lie in that respect.
Yeah, and that's a good point, actually, because we're also the women's game, especially in football, was starting to make some progress in terms of national broadcast, and especially since the World Cup last year, they are going to be potentially the women's game is potentially going to be one of the big losers, isn't it? Because it's losing that momentum. We don't know when the fans are going to be allowed back in the stadiums, as we say, and it's just as you say, the priorities from broadcasters maybe appear to be elsewhere. It could really suffer.
Yes, and they've obviously had the European Championships pushed back another year, but as a knock-on effect of the men's Euros being pushed back a year. So, yeah, absolutely. Any kind of momentum that kind of came out of the World Cup, yeah, it's been well and truly sort of lost, really, which is, I think, a real pity. And that opportunity to kind of get the momentum going again is unfortunately still quite a long way away in many respects. So, yeah, I think difficult sort of knock-on effects from this, which is a real sort of shame. In many respects. Yeah.
We don't know when sport's going to go back to normal. Let's move on to a book that you're working on. Can you tell us a bit about that before we talk about the way that sort of sports journalism is being disrupted in general?
Yeah, I mean, there's a book series, a Routledge book series called Digital Disruptions, which is very much a sort of journalism studies thing, where sort of different academics are looking at different aspects of journalistic practice, really, and looking at how the sort of digital age has kind of changed it, how it's disrupted it. And I'm writing a sort of book on disrupting sports journalism. So it's just a sort of kind of general book, really, that looks at kind of those, what the digital age has meant for sports journalism, but really thinking about it in terms of kind of almost an existential crisis in many ways, where, for many years sports journalism was used to kind of having a real sort of monopoly, over sports communication, and now it's kind of one of those kind of many voices, I guess. And where does that leave sports journalism in terms of a kind of professional project, really, in terms of their distinctiveness, in terms of their cultural authority? Society has a lot of expectations of sports journalists at a lot of different levels, whether that's being a sort of, watching on power, making power, whether it's being socially and ethically responsible in its reporting, how it's kind of projecting political issues that are manifesting itself in sport. There's all sorts of different expectations on sports journalism. And, the reality is, in addition, it's become increasingly difficult for sports journalism to achieve those things. I mean, you said earlier about, for example, the impact of COVID. The moment you kind of get rid of, freelancers, you're in a situation where, all the guys in the office, all the staff are in a situation where they've got to work harder, they're spread more thinly. And that opportunity to kind of do more considered, more reflective, more analytical sports journalism kind of gets further away, because the thing is, with internet, you're feeding the beast. It's that constant publication, constantly putting out fresh output, and still much time to kind of think about it. It's all very much sort of surface level sort of content, really. So, there's a lot of challenges really around sports journalism. The fact that you've got a lot of kind of encroachment, if you like, on their territory, whether that's from bloggers, whether it's from clubs themselves. I saw the Totspur website, was it yesterday or the day before, run an exclusive with Jose Mourinho. I mean, this is the domain of journalism, running exclusives, and there it is, the actual kind of club sort of PR department basically are, and it's quite bizarre, really, because they should be getting exclusives. I mean, the whole point of an exclusive in journalism is that you kind of, there's a level of kind of journalistic nous and kind of working contacts to kind of get there. But yeah, it's quite bizarre. A club breaks its own news and it describes it as an exclusive. So straight away, that kind of tells you a lot about that encroachment on sports journalism territory, and how sports journalism trying to kind of repel those kind of challenges, and how it kind of maintains its own boundaries. And that's really crucial, because if it can't maintain those boundaries and it can't prove its expertise and its distinctiveness, then that leaves serious questions in terms of its cultural authority, in terms of its kind of public trust, and in terms of its kind of very sort of existence, really, in terms of how we traditionally understand sports journalism to be. So I think a big question that the book is kind of considering is sports journalism kind of morphing into something different in terms of what it is as a professional field, and in terms of who belongs to that professional field. So it's a book that's really trying to kind of ask bigger kind of existential questions around sports journalism and what this might look like going forward, and how this feeds into those kind of societal expectations of what they should be doing and what they're there for, really.
Let's tackle a few of those bits. I mean, first of all, do you think there's a bit of a danger that sports journalism sort of misses the generation, at least? So the younger generation are often consuming their sports news, or, well, should we call it sports content instead, I guess, through blogs originally, but now it's YouTube channels, it's influencers, it's fans TV, it's fan podcasts, which often get like the odd guest on. Maybe some clubs are even helping them get it instead of going to the sports journalist, because you're probably going to get a little bit less scrutiny and a good amount of positive PR. So do you think like some of the younger generation maybe aren't consuming the sort of harder sports journalism potentially?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, I suppose journalism in general has always had this kind of issue where what tends to get the kind of most, the biggest audience tends to be, how can I say this, the less robust sort of journalism, if you can call it that. We're talking about the kind of celebrity news, etc., the sort of tittle-tattle aspects of it. And we've got to remember, and I guess this is the whole thing about journalism, is ultimately there's a tension between the fact that journalism works in, it's in the private sector. As a journalist, you're working for a company that needs to make a profit, that needs to, it's answerable to shareholders. Even local papers, are owned, a company like NewsQuest is a subsidiary of a great big American media conglomerate, really. And, so nothing's immune from this. So as a journalist, ultimately, you're working very much in that kind of commercial imperative, really, where it is about generating audiences and it is about generating advertising revenue, because that pays the way. So whatever that takes, you're going to kind of do it. But then you've got the professional side of it, where, certainly when you think about journalism training, it's really all about the professional aspects, principles such as, objectivity, autonomy, ethics, public interest. And, sometimes those kind of professional objectives and principles are kind of conflict with the commercial imperative. Sometimes the commercial imperative can take journalists into, arguably quite unethical areas. So there's this tension really at the heart of the kind of profession generally, between that commercial imperative and the professional principles. Sometimes, they kind of dovetail quite nicely, but a lot of the times there can be this conflict and this kind of tension. I guess that's kind of where we're at, really. I think the question for journalism around the kind of weightier hard news, as you say, is, okay, you may not necessarily attract as big an audiences, but is there a bigger picture here in terms of the kind of prestige, the credibility that actually gives your news organization? And particularly as we've seen this movement towards kind of more subscription based models, we look at the likes of the Times, we look at the Telegraph, for instance. There is, what comes with that, I think, is a real obligation and a requirement, really, to be producing quality journalism, because for people to subscribe, that's what they really want. They want to feel like they're getting something that they can't necessarily get elsewhere. And that leads in to your other question, which is around journalistic access, which generally speaking has become quite amorphous, highly restricted, and therefore that leads to quite homogenous sort of kind of sports news. So if you're in a situation where you're behind a paywall and you've got to try and get something different to a sports journalist that's not behind a paywall, how do you do that? It's actually really difficult to, because the access is so tightly restricted. It's really hard to kind of break out of that and sort of generate more kind of original content. So all of this is just one big cyclical crisis really for the profession. It's got to try and find a way out of this, and it's got to think creatively and imaginatively about where it takes things in the future. And I think part of that is actually sort of moving away from that reliance on official sources or the kind of sports cycle of getting all your news from clubs, from governing bodies. And it's about trying to perhaps, certainly talk more, engage more with fans, fan stories, and try and kind of fall back more on kind of really good, solid news principles of developing a good wide contact base. And I think that would help to kind of restore sports journalists' kind of trust with the public. Because I think for years now, there's been probably a general feeling that sports journalism is part of that kind of corporate and commercial machinery that apparates around professional sports. And I think it just needs a little bit of a reassessment to try and kind of break out of that reliance, I think, on those kind of official sources, really.
Yeah, you brought up the Times and the Telegraph behind their subscription, behind the paywall. They've still got to operate a newspaper as well daily, and we'll come to maybe where newspapers may be going in just a bit. But then you've got specialist subscription services like The Athletic, which launched in the UK last summer after starting in the USA. And the aim there is actually sort of the anti what you've been talking about before about feeding the beast. It's about less churn. It's about more quality sports writing, time to get a quality piece together. It is refreshing. Do you think it's a good model that would be that's going to really break through here properly? Because we don't really know how well the Athletic's performing. Lots of decent PR, lots of subscription offers as well, though, throughout this last year.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what I will say is from a sports journalism education point of view, that was a great development. I mean, that really was, manna from heaven in terms of moving the kind of conversation around sports journalism forward. And it was a very interesting new model that emerged. And I think where it was a real shake-up for that industry is, sports journalism has always been very much kind of entwined with traditional media, and there was a sense that if you didn't work for traditional media, you weren't a proper sports journalist. And I think for a few years now, certainly the narrative against more kind of maybe bloggers, more alternative sources of sports journalism, inverted commas, you can kind of argue that narrative. But then suddenly you're in a situation where you've got sports journalists who are working for traditional media suddenly going over to this new venture, and it just kind of throws the whole thing up in the air about what's legitimate sports journalism and where is the actual home of sports journalism. And obviously it's now becoming increasingly fragmented. And yeah, really interesting. I mean, what I would say about that is what I think is so interesting about it's a truly global sports journalism model in many respects. It's, well, maybe global's taking a bit too far, but certainly it's a transatlantic model. And what it kind of perhaps is failing to consider a little bit is the kind of different historical trajectories of sports journalism in the US compared to the UK. Whereas in the US, sport has always existed as this kind of specialist form of media. Whereas the UK, since the late sort of late 19th, early 20th centuries, it kind of specialist sporting press really sort of died out as a force and never kind of re-established meaningfully. And we've always associated sports journalism as part of a kind of wider newsroom, as part of a wider newspaper product. So in America, that wasn't such a big leap of faith, I think, for sports fans as it has been in the UK, where we just don't have that kind of that cultural way of kind of consuming media, but we associate sport with alongside other forms of journalism. So I think it's been really interesting to see that, and you can't assume that just because it's worked in America, that model is going to work in the UK for those reasons. I mean, obviously, what's happened with this in lockdown is, well, look, I mean, if you've got sort of traditional newspaper organisations where there's no sport happening, to a certain, so we talked about Telegraph and Times. Now, if you're a Telegraph Times subscriber, you're in a situation there where actually it's not just about the sport. I'm not, I may be subscribing mainly for the sport, but, I'm reading the news, I'm reading pull-out sections, whatever. There's more to it. But what happened in lockdown is you've got a subscription service that's all about sport, that's only about sport. And that is where you kind of come unstuck a little bit. And nobody saw this coming. But I think that's put the Athletic in a realm where they've got very different considerations to other news organizations. And maybe it's kind of exposed the vulnerability of that kind of specialist sport model when you get to these sorts of crises, really, if you like. So, yeah, I think really interesting. It'd be interesting to see how they kind of plan in the future. But, like I said earlier, the sort of wheels are back on track. There's football to write about, there's cricket now to write about, and other sports will be coming on sort of stream soon. So things look like they're back up and running again. But I think it's been interesting. It kind of really makes you realize what are the different, maybe not so much limitations, but different considerations of these different business models. And also the other thing to say about the Athletic is, we kind of need to think about this model really more alongside maybe a sort of kind of Sky Sports package, maybe even alongside a Netflix, Amazon Prime. And that's certainly how the Athletic have kind of positioned themselves. They've kind of described themselves as the Netflix of sports. But, what we had in lockdown, it's a bit like Netflix saying, look, we can't show you all the latest shows. We've got to set, we're going to show you 70s sitcoms, instead. And, it's different once you kind of set your stall out and saying, this is where we are. It's just a realization, I guess, that sport is quite crisis prone in many respects. It's quite unpredictable, and they're probably thinking strategically. They've got to build in more contingency, I think, in future.
Final question then, really, just about newspapers. Like, what do you think they need to do to survive? Like, what's the future of newspapers? We've seen the Guardian. They announced that almost 200 people are going to be losing their jobs. It's a really tricky time for papers, and they're in a bit of a transition, aren't they? Deciding what they're going to do, and how can they compete? Are we going to see them around in, I don't know, 20, 30 years time? What's your prediction?
Gosh, I mean, it's a really good question. It's a real sort of kind of silver bullet of an answer, and nobody really knows. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, what we've seen over the last sort of 20 years, a lot of kind of mergers, particularly in terms of Sunday operations merging with their daily operations. We've seen mergers across titles, for example, with sort of Reach PLC, where you've now got the Mirror and you've got the Express in the same stable. And I think we're just going to see a continuation of that, really. So just more and more increased consolidation, which is really bad for the news industry, in the sense that you then get even further away from that kind of plurality of different news and different people producing that news. It's absolutely vital for healthy democratic society, really. But the more and more it consolidates, the more it's just going to kind of be a very limited and repetitive kind of stream of news, and probably an increased reliance, and it's been going this way for a long time, on press agencies such as Press Association and Reuters. And really, really difficult. I mean, it just feels like it's being massively deprofessionalized at the moment as well, where sort of the salaries are kind of going out of journalism and have been for a long time. And I mean, if you look at us as a course, as a subject area at the university, we have a lot of graduates now who sort of move into PR roles. And I think as PR and journalism continues to blur, I think what we're going to see is a continued expansion of that kind of sector, where we're not then, you're not thinking so much about job opportunities at traditional media. You're more thinking in terms of working as a journalist within a, maybe not kind of primarily non-journalistic organisation. And I mean, all that's going to happen, I think, is the PR sector will continue to expand and become more journalistic-like in character. So I think that's probably where it's looking. In terms of what newspapers need to survive, I think, it's really easy just to kind of throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, well, what can you do? You know, the internet is kind of killing us really. But I think, you know, newspapers could do a lot more to produce a better product really. I mean, if you look at, for example, the local media, I mean, I just think if you're a local newspaper, your number one priority has got to be covering court, covering council. But I don't think that's something that's really happened. So straight away, it's kind of, yeah, there's a question of priorities there in terms of what kind of news are you actually generating and what value there is in that news. And also, I just think it's just, you know, getting better distribution models. I think, you know, there's been a sort of kind of general recognition in, you know, for a while that we're getting away from the physical newspaper. But, you know, who's to say that there isn't this renaissance towards kind of reaction towards kind of quality journalism, towards you know, consuming news through a newspaper again. And yeah, no newspaper really has a very decent distribution model in terms of how it actually gets a newspaper to people, to its consumers. So yeah, the industry I don't think has helped itself in this kind of period either. I don't think it's necessarily got its priorities right. And yeah, I'm not sure if it's responded to, I don't think it's done enough to evolve and change the way and reimagine what journalism is. I think it kind of thought it could get away with just doing the same old thing, same old, and eventually it will all be fine. And that's obviously not turned out to be the case. So I think it could have done a lot more to sort of adapt and reconsider what it is and how to do things.
Really looking forward to reading the book. When will it be out roughly?
Yes, it's still a while off. It'll be later second half of next year.
Right.
Yeah, I think it'll probably be around that time really. So
cool.
Yeah.
Cool. We end every podcast with some sort of random questions, quick fire away from your work. First is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Do you know what? I mean, I think being young is difficult enough as it is. There's a lot of pressure, and you're trying to make big decisions that are going to shape the rest of your life. And I don't know, you get so much advice coming at you from people who are older than you, and you know, I'm not sure adding another voice to that is going to help. I'm not sure my younger self will probably listen to my older self, to be honest. So yeah, I'd probably keep a powder dry there and just let my younger self just make the mistakes, because I think sometimes you just have to. And I don't know. Trying to intervene in that aspect is wise, really. I think you have to that's part of life, is the making mistakes, is the figuring things out, and yeah, going your own journey. It's hard to see how it wouldn't come across as massively patronising, to be honest.
If you could pick any other subject to study at the University of Brighton, what might that be?
Oh, crikey. I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, journalism is all about storytelling. And I think something like creative writing is interesting in the sense that's also about storytelling, but in a very different way to journalism. So I think I'd be quite interested how a subject like that kind of looks at that storytelling process differently to journalism. So I think that there'd be a curiosity there, I think.
Pick a favourite place in Sussex.
I'm not from Sussex originally, so I'm not sure I know it as well as I should. I mean, I've lived here for years, but yeah, I should have got out a lot more. Yeah, I mean, I live in Eastbourne, and I really like it here. I think it's a really nice. The great thing about Sussex, particularly when we think about the major conurbations along the coast, Brighton, Eastbourne, and then Hastings. What I really like about that is they're three very different places, but they're great in their own right. So I think, you know, depending on when the mood takes you, I think you've got something there. And I mean, you know, I guess I kind of gravitate more towards Eastbourne because I know it better than any other area. And I think if you know somewhere that well, then yeah, you're probably in a better position to say, yeah, that's I like a lot about it. So yeah, I'll go with that. But yeah, I think it's a great county. You know, great. You know, Alfriston's amazing up the road here. It's a lovely village and some great places here. I mean, I'd recommend it to anyone. I mean, particularly in terms of a place, you know, for students to study, for example. It's you know, particularly if you like an outdoors life, particularly around here. You couldn't ask for more, really. It's fantastic.
Tell us something interesting about you, which a lot of people may not know.
Oh, well, I don't think it's not necessarily interesting, but it's a bit weird. But I actually have a fear of frogs and toads, which is actually a proper phobia. It's called phobia. Yeah, it's
Okay,
actually a
yeah.
proper medical thing. So yeah, that's really bizarre, but yeah, that's a thing that happens really. And yeah, a few months ago, my next door neighbours got a new pond. So yeah, you can imagine
Yeah.
the sort of anxiety I'm faced stepping outside into the garden every time now. So yeah, I need to deal with this at some point, I think.
Okay. Okay. And if you could pick three people to host at a dinner party, they could be past or present, who would they be and why?
Past or present? Oh, crikey. I mean, uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to answer this kind of question without it's just sounding really cringe. And I just think I'm going to
Be
probably
as cringe as you like.
Well, I'm going to say my wife and two kids, because who else would I rather have dinner with? And to be honest, anyone else, if I start talking about famous people, they're just people I don't know. So they say never meet your heroes as well. So
That's true.
and I think my general experience of kind of meeting people I've admired from afar and seen them in the flesh is generally sort of kind of probably one of disappointment. So yeah, I'll probably stick to what I know, who I'm familiar with, really.
Simon, thanks so much for coming on. Really great to get your thoughts on so many of those issues. And if you want to look into studying with us, take a look at our website, brighton.ac.uk. Clearing is open now for this year. And you can also look at the courses to study in 2021. A couple of good courses there, and all the information is on the website. That's it for this week. Please do like, subscribe and review. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.